Good evening. My name is Rai Nazar Hayat, and you are hearing my podcast, whose name is RNH Spotlight. We live in a time when media is everywhere, truth is contested, and two parallel realities often seem more real to people than facts. Against that backdrop, late night comedy is not frivolous. It is a pressure valve, a skeptical mirror, a resonance chamber for civic anxieties. The current conflict between Trump and his regulatory allies and comedians like Kimmel is not accidental. It's a symptom of deeper tensions in American democracy: narrative control versus free critique, regulatory power versus expressive freedom, fear versus courage. This war is already shaping what can be joked about, who gets laughed at, and who gets to laugh. If the pendulum swings too far toward control, not only comedians, but the audience will lose something essential: a space to question, to mock, to dissent. If instead the free speech defenders maintain or strengthen norms and legal guardrails, this episode could galvanize a new understanding that mocking power is not just optional, but essential. On September 17, 2025, Jimmy Kimmel Alive was suspended indefinitely by ABC following a monologue by Kimmel about the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Kimmel criticized what he saw as attempts by MAGA supporters to capitalize on Kirk's murder for political gain, and also mocked the president's reaction to it. The monologue drew fierce backlash from conservatives, especially affiliates of ABC, Nexstar, Sinclair, and regulatory pressure from Federal Communications Commission (FCC) Chair Brendan Carr. Carr threatened regulatory action against networks or local stations that aired Kimmel's remarks. Trump praised the suspension, blamed negative coverage, and floated ideas about revoking licenses for broadcasters perceived as hostile. Critics, including legal experts, free speech advocates, some Republicans, see this as a worrying encroachment on norms of press freedom. That's the spark. What it highlights is a deeper, ongoing fight over power, speech, narrative, and who gets to walk home. There are historical precedents to it. US presidents have long had uneasy relations with comedians, satirists, and the press. The Smother Brothers in the 60s, Nixon's attempt pressure to broadcast licensing during Watergate are not identical today, but they show that this tension of speech is baked into the system. Regulatory, the FCC has a legal authority over broadcast licenses. Media has fragmented and ideas has been polarized, and there is a political retaliation precedent as well. So what is at stake here? Stake is free speech norms, the First Amendment risk. In the US, free speech is constitutional bedrock. Threatening removal or severe limitation of broadcast licenses because of critical mocking content may chill speech. Hosts, writers, networks might self-censor rather than risk regulatory backlash. Even if the law is ambiguous in certain respects, the fear alone can change behavior. Local stations and national networks rely on regulatory apparatus. Licenses are granted with conditions of public interest access. If these conditions are interpreted broadly to include "don't offend the administration," that shifts what broadcasters can safely say, especially when mergers, ownership changes, business deals are also pending and need FCC approval. Narrative control, also a very important segment. Comedians are part of how Americans understand power. Monologues travel in clips. They shape shared language. They amplify grievance and criticism. If a president can blunt that sharp edge, he can shape not just policy but meaning. This is about culture. It's about what stories get joked, which get suppressed, which are met with compliance. It matters of politics for civic discourse. Precedent for future speech suppression is also there. If this norm becomes accepted, speech critical of president invites regulatory consequences. It becomes hard to roll back. And the precedent works both ways. not just for satire, but for journalism, for op-eds, even for academic or corporate speech. It also sets expectations for what audience may accept. Norms, in fact, shift. So, for fairness, what are the arguments in favor of what's happening with the administration side? What weakness or counterpoint exists? Defenses, broadcast spectrum is public resource. The argument is that the broadcasters use public airwaves, have obligation to serve the public interest, and shouldn't spread misinformation or disrespect societal norms, especially around tragedies. If the fair regulators have some say, there's an accountability, there's a business responsibility, there are legal constraints, and then it has chilling effect. Even if the action is legal, the threat alone may lead to self-censorship. Hosts or networks may avoid satire, critique of the administration, because the word public interest and can involve regulatory overreach. If public interest is defined too loosely, which means no, don't offend the administration, that becomes the criterion. So, regulatory power can blunt the instrument for partisan suppression. There's a legalist. There's a political blowback. Even some Republicans are uneasy about it. The case of Ted Cruz, who criticized FCC Chair Carl's threats, shows that overreach can alienate parts of the base that still believes in free speech. Damage to democratic norms may reduce trust in institutions more broadly. So there are some deeper themes as to what this says about power, comedy, and society. This war, beyond the immediate, this war between the presidency and the late night reflects broader cultural, political, media dynamics. Some deeper observations are here. Comedy is a check and mirror. Humor has always played a role in democracy in the form of dissent, reflection, relief. When power becomes more sensitive, comedy becomes more threatening. The degree to which power tolerates mockery is a measure of how stable or confident it is. Narrative economy is in algorithm area. The monologue, a late night statement, isn't just entertainment in TV schedule, but content that gets clipped, reposted, meme. First impression of day are shaped by what jokes go viral. That gives comedians new influence. Normalization of authority via regulation. Polarization also makes outrage profitable, and pre-authoritarian tendencies. Not to be alarmist, but many arguments be made, threats to license, pressure to self-censor contents, critical of leadership, regulatory and enforcement or bias are historically red flags in society that lose free press. Whether or not we are there, this drift deserves attention. The recent case has clarified some of the states and mechanics. What are the outcomes? Well, one can say what kind the regulatory threats have teeth. When Carr suggested ABC affiliates by with consequences, stations independently pulled Jimmy Kimmel live from their lineup. This shows that even without direct force, officialization can trigger rapid industry compliance. So what might happen going forward? Drawing from the pattern of the recent trend, there are few possible trajectories. More preventive self-control, hosts, writers, networks might preempt critical content, make those safer, especially when dealing with topics critical sensitive. It can have legal challenges. It can have new regulatory norms or formal rules. It can shift late night geography. More content may migrate to streaming podcasts, YouTube, non-broadcast channels where regulatory license is less of a lever. The bite of FCC threat is weaker there, so satirists might increasingly go outside the reach of traditional broadcast. The audience fragmentation deepening is likely will increase choose spaces, channels, platforms that reflect their political identity, reducing shared cultural norms that make the war more local, even more tribal. Well, in the end, I would conclude why this war is about more than laughter. It might be tempted to frame this simply as a celebrity drama, but it's more than that. There is a legitimacy of power. Leaders in democracies need legitimacy not just via election, but via perceived fairness, openness, tolerance. When criticism is punished or appears to be, legitimacy erodes. Culture, not just politics. Satire is part of circulating lifeblood of culture. It shares metaphors, shares stories, what people believe is acceptable. If satire is muzzled, culture loses feedback loop it needs to survive consciousness. There is a precedent for authoritarian drift. Even if Current actions don't violate law. The patterns of threat plus punishment plus control or narrative has echoes in places where defaults shifted gradually towards suppression. It's harder to reverse than to prevent. Democratic resilience also depends upon dissent. A society in which only safe criticism is tolerated tends towards stagnation. If comedy cannot push boundaries, then fierce disagreement, irony, mockery, things that sometimes hurt but sometimes help, will weaken. In the end, the Los Angeles soundstage or New York studio is more than a place of gags. It's a front line in struggle for what kind of public life America will defend. If late night loses some of its bite, so too might America lose some of its sharpness. And sometimes sharpness is what saves us from being softened by fear. My name is Rai Nazar Hayat, and you are hearing my podcast by the name of RNH Spotlight. Goodbye.